Okay, so how to implement separation of concerns. So you got a collection of concerns and you do a for loop and you do something with each concern. This talk is actually not about any type of writing code. It's more about the principles. So this is a joke. There's no implementation for separation of concerns. There's no framework that's going to do separation of concerns for you. As a matter of fact, there's an opposite. There are frameworks that break separation of concerns. So what this talk is not about, frameworks that do things for us. So I'm not going to be talking about Angular or any cool new thing out there. This is not about the single responsibility principle or coupling versus cohesion, because these terms are frequently mixed up. And when I ask in an interview, do you know what separation of concerns is? I frequently get coupling versus cohesion or single responsibility principle sent back to me. But whenever I ask what single responsibility principle is or other things, no one ever tells me separation of concerns. They never define separation of concerns for me. So it seems like one of those principles that is less thought of, at least, if not less known. So what this talk is about, it's about roles. So there's a lot of roles that is a good audience for this talk. QA, BA, but mostly coders. Coders would be like the main audience. But this is also a good talk for QA and BA. As well as anyone on the vision team business side and further back DBA, deeper into that also. This is about hats. Hats is sort of a synonym for roles, but one person could wear multiple hats. So I'm not talking to you, the viewer. Whenever I talk about any of this stuff, I'm talking about a role. So if I say the developer or the DBA or something like that, I'm not saying one person is a developer, because a developer might also be a DBA for a company. Who knows? So roles, hats, and the processes. These are the processes, how coding matches up with the business processes, because those two things are tightly coupled, whether you like it or not. Those are things that you go together. So knowing that, we're going to start from the beginning. So in the beginning, you have a vision. You have the vision team, the C-level people, the product owners. You have these people saying, we want a new system, a new product, or we want just a new feature added to a product, something like that. And they make user stories. And user stories are, they're the point where the business connects with the developers. And in the user stories, you have the BAs will be writing up acceptance criteria. The QAs will be adding test cases, and the developers will be putting a bunch of tasks on these user stories. But let's start with user stories as a main concept, because that's a huge part of separation of concerns, is understanding the user story portion. So before I define separation of concerns and get more into it, this is a good starting point. A user story, as a customer, I want to be able to create a shopping cart so that I can review items I want to buy. So this is from the perspective of a user. I write this story, even though this is for the business writes this. As a customer, that's like your authorization. Anything that you want to read into this, as a customer, that's your authorization. It might say as an admin, as an anonymous user, something like that. So as a customer, as a developer, you read that, you say, this is how I'm going to be authorizing this person. Of course, you're going to get in more detail later, but you can look at the user story and then you can visualize these are the people who are going to be using this feature. I want to be able to create a shopping cart. So, you go to a website, you make a shopping cart, you add items to your shopping cart, so that I can review the items I want to buy, because at some point you're going to check out, whatever the case is. Another user story, as a customer, I want to be able to check out. And this is like the payment system, so that I can purchase my items in my cart. They may or may not check out. They might just have a shopping cart on there like Amazon or whatever, and just keep that cached and add and remove like a wish list or something like that. But the checkout system is, the payment system is this whole other thing. And then as a customer, I want to be able to view my orders so that I can track purchase receipts. So later on, after you buy things, you go back and you can do your taxes or whatever the case is, but you can see your orders that you've made previously. Okay, so the business concern, this is one of the concerns of grooming user stories. So from the perspective of a business, like I was saying, they have those three parts, and it's backwards compared to that slide before, but they have the business goal, like the value that they're going to be creating. And that's the so that portion. And then you have the feature. That's the thing that you're actually going to be implementing, the shopping cart, the checkout system, the page that you can view your orders. And then you have your audience. Use my mouse a little bit here. Okay, here we go. So you have your audience, and as an administrator, that's your authorization roles and whatnot. So from the perspective of the user, it says, as the audience, I want this thing so that some value it provides to me. And that's why we write user stories, is because it's from the perspective of the user. And most importantly, it forces the business people to really think about the thing they're asking for and put a business value on it. A lot of times you ask the business analysts or the product owners, hey, can you write this as a user story? And they say, I don't understand how to write it. I can't really articulate the idea in this way. And if they can't get these parts across, it's something that sometimes the developer has to work with them to help them understand the agile process. But I don't want to get too far into this because this isn't a coaching session about how to do user stories. It's just that I'm really trying to get the mindset in here that there's a lot to making a user story, as one of the concerns of software development. So the business controls the business requirements. So they decide the priority in the business needs. They move things up and down in priority. And when they're making user stories, a lot of times part of the vision team is the UI, the UX, the designers. They're in there saying, okay, well, how are you going to want this to look? And they're trying to lay out the page, and they're working very closely with the vision team. So this business story that we're looking at here is very, very nearby, working directly with the UI UX team. So this is a gradient that I'm going to fill in as we go along with a couple of these slides. And this gradient has the business/vision, like I was just talking about, and they interface with the UI UX design, the design portion of the team. So now let's take a step back to the business again and say the business also interacts with the design. So now let's talk about the design side of things. So the business interacts with design. And now we're going to talk about tasks. So I have the word task here. This is no longer user stories, but these are going to fall in line. There are 3 user stories. We've got 3 tasks here. There's going to be a lot more tasks per user story, but I just put 1 task as an example for each user story. So for the shopping cart, design the shopping cart to have, and then you put colors, icons, the layouts, and mock-ups and pictures and stuff like that. And this isn't a user story. So this is not following the as a, I want, so that. This is a task. So there's going to be some technical jargon in here, or some artsy jargon in here for the marketing team or the design team, the UI UX people. They're going to be putting that sort of stuff in here. And the other task for the checkout system, design the payment process, the checkout process, to have, this is the UI UX stuff. This is all the stuff that we need. They're going to have these tasks on their user story. And then for the orders page, so you can review your orders, design the pending and previous orders page to have, and all the things that it needs to have. So business and the UI and UX design team, they overlap, just like that gradient showed a little bit back there. The business works with the designers and the UI developers to figure out what is needed to fulfill the requirements of the user story. So you have all these tasks, they're attached to the user story, and they're all in the domain of the design, the designers and the business people. So the UI UX people decide on the roles, the UI UX roles, decide on the direction and the technologies to use, which CDNs to use, which component libraries to use, textures, frameworks. They're deciding on all these sort of things for their part of the system. So you have the business people have decided all the things they want, the compliance, the legal stuff. They've done all their part. They've created the user story. And they're essentially, as you come down here, they interface with the UI developers and the designers to request, if you see this last word down here, to request of them to do this stuff. Now, they're not going to come to them and say, do a thing, and this is exactly what I want. They're going to say, please do something like this. And the UI UX people are going to go do market research, and they're going to find the best interactivity that they're going to use for the website. They're going to look into the current subscriptions that they have. They're going to do all this stuff that they need to do, not because the business tells them to do something, but they say, do the research, mock some things up, and let's go over it. And you really try to push this request mentality of we're going to work together and collaborate, instead of one person telling another person to do what to do. So now we've got our gradient here. We've got business and vision. They're working with UX and UI, and these circles are going to sometimes be a little hard to see, I guess. UX, UI, and UI development. The development part is, the services, the TypeScript and the JavaScript and the frameworks, and the designers. And then you have the, I think I said this back here. So the UI developers and designers also work with the API engineers to say, we're going to need to be calling some APIs. So you guys are going to have to get started on that type of thing. And these are the type of things we're going to need. You send us back this, we'll send you this. And the API developers say, oh, we've already got something for that. They're going to be collaborating. So the UI developers who are writing the scripts, the JavaScript and the TypeScript and the services in the back part of the UI are going to be working with the API engineers. Okay, so now we have the business people talking to the domain engineers. These are the people who are working in the back end, putting the business rules and the business logic and doing the development that need to do the conditional transformations, essentially the functional part of the back end. So they have their own tasks. We have a task for the shopping cart, and the wording is fairly important. That's why I'm reading this word for word for some of these slides. Consume the item SDK to create a cached versions for some amount of time in the shopping cart that's kept in Redis that's DTO'd as order items until they check out. Pull merchant configurations, this is for the payment processing. Pull merchant configurations from the secure key vault and integrate with WorldPay, who's one of the biggest merchant processors, so I just use them, to send the unique user key so WorldPay can work with the stored credit card and we can remain PCI compliant. And then query the reporting data sources to transform a set of cached order items. The point of reading these words here is to see there's sort of a different mentality going on here. It's no longer we need the user interface to be easily understood by the user and have a certain button here, and it's something the user's going to click on and they're going to see some other result. This is like the mentality of a domain developer. They don't really care when a user is going to see a button, if it's going to be in a pop-up, if it's going to be whatever the case is. That's not really in the mind of a domain developer. So it's sort of like the wording of these tasks, which are owned by the domain developer, they look a lot different. And so the business and the domain is overlapping. That's what we're talking about here. The business works with the backend dev to see what needs to happen in order to fulfill user story. So all those tasks that we were just talking about, these tasks are in the domain of business logic and business rules. They're owned by the developer. You don't have QA say, okay, QA, create me tasks or whatever. You'll have the domain developer in the meetings when they're grooming user stories or talking about user stories and saying, okay, we're going to need to do these things. We're going to take notes. We're going to ask the product owner, exactly what you want to do. We're going to look at the QA's test cases and say, okay, these test cases technically make it very easy to read. They're going to read the acceptance criteria. They're going to build all this stuff with collaboration. So the backend devs are going to be deciding all the things that need to happen. They're going to be deciding which NuGet package to use, design patterns, core organizations for interfaces. They're going to decide all this stuff. And then the backend devs are also going to be working with data devs, building the data repositories or the DBAs in order to have them approve migration scripts to add tables and columns and change data types and stuff like that. But most importantly here, when they're working with the DBAs and the data devs, they're requesting to them. They're not saying, a domain developer won't go to a DBA and say, create a table, do this with these data types and these indexes or whatever the case is. They're going to say, we need these things, let's talk about it. And we need you guys to figure out, what's the most performant index to put on there and all that sort of stuff. That's for them to decide. And again, I'm talking about roles. So if you're the person who can take off that domain hat, step over and put on the DBA hat, that's great. So you're discussing it with yourself or you're deciding for yourself. But in general, the roles it goes into this very request and very friendly system. So the business and the vision team is working with the domain developers for the domain logic, and the domain developers are also working with the data repo. Got a couple more items here on our gradient. So the domain devs, now they're working with the data. So that's what we're going into now. The domain devs are working with the DBAs and such like that. And the data devs or the DBAs say, partition a new data schema with these data types and these columns and these indexes and the data columns copied from the inventory.item data table. And I don't need to read the rest of them, but the general idea is we're getting into the further you get from the business, the more technical you're getting. And if you show this to a business person, the CEO says, hey, build me a shopping cart. And you're like, here's the thing. They'd be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. This is so far away from the business, completely different mindset. Also, the data devs, don't care how the API, for example, is structured. They don't care. You bring in an API and the API validates certain fields or whatever the case is, and then it's doing some transformational logic. And they only care from the part where the very back boundary of the application, the repositories, the data repos, are then making the SQL calls or building the tables or querying the tables. They care about that stuff. They care about disaster recovery. They care about things that are happening in the database. So the domain devs and the data devs overlap, and the domain devs work with the data devs to figure out what persistence and entity changes need to happen. And so we're in this point now where this is controlled by the DBAs and the data devs. Sometimes they're the same person, sometimes they work closely together, sometimes they're, there's a gradient like I've been showing of different people. So the data devs and DBAs, they decide if they're using a graph database, they're using a database that already exists, we need to spin up a new NoSQL database, or this is a special thing, we need a document database. They're deciding all these technology and stuff like that. You don't have the product owner who created the user story say, oh, we need a new shopping cart, build this table with these columns using this type of database. I'd flip out. I'd say, why are you doing this sort of thing? Like I said, be collaborative, have these open meetings. But when it comes time to make these big decisions, it's the DBAs. This is the DBA's responsibilities, who can receive input that they'll listen to carefully to people adjacent to them. And they'll probably take into consideration, but listen less and less carefully the further down the gradient that you go. But yeah, this is keeping with this gradient and trying to stay in your lane, essentially, as / is saying. And so the DBAs are in charge of that stuff. Oops, I double skipped it. Okay, so yeah, the domain logic works with the DBAs and the data repo people, because they're going to be working with models that are transferred to entities and doing something with the repository toward the back end. Yeah, listening less carefully down the gradient. That's a perfect way to put it. Thanks, Kimberly. So now we have this other interaction on the gradient, from the user interface to the domain. So this is a task, for example, on page load, to get this is the UI dev. It could be a web dev, could be an application dev. It's the UI dev who's building those back services, maybe in JavaScript or maybe inside of their native language, that are going to be making calls to the API. And they'll have a task like on page load. Let's do the middle one. On click for the submit button. So we're still talking about UI language here. We're sort of moved back on the gradient to the other side, to the beginning side again. On click for the submit button for a payment, send a body with the JSON with the user and the payment info to, and you have this post API with an order ID on there. Because when you do a checkout, you don't resend the order. The order is already in a shopping cart that's sort of cached, or it's somewhere that can be queried by the payment service. And so you say, here's this order ID that they've had. And these are the type of tasks that you see on the web developer or the UI developer who's working in the JavaScript and the native language, not necessarily doing the design side, but doing like the backend side of that sort of thing. And so these devs, these backend, or the back end of the front end, web devs or UI devs, this is the same exact type of screen that I've already shown 3 or 4 times. They're writing tasks that are working with their stuff, but they're also collaborating tasks with like the API and SDK developer. So whenever they say, I need this task that's going to call a post with this URL in it and maybe some URL parameters or some query string, they don't just come up with that, because it's not really a UI developer's task. It's not their lane, for example, to tell the API, hey, build me an API with this thing. Because the API developers might already have an API that the front end didn't know about, the UI devs didn't know about. Or they could have one that's like really close. They just need to do a slight adjustment to it or something like that. So there's the collaboration that's happening there to work with those people. So now we've got this. This is sort of like the end of it all. So there's all kinds of lines going on here, and it shows the different adjacent connections that you make with people. So like UI development, working with API engineers and domain logic, or UX, UI, and UI development work really closely together. And it's got all these lines. And the the good thing, depends on how you look at it, this is the clean, nice and neat way to put it. And each one of these circles is sort of like, these are the collaborative groups, and they're all sort of intermingled a little bit, and it's a gradient. It's not this group and then there's space, and then there's this group with like, and they're like separated. It's a gradient concerns. These people are concerned with this, these people are concerned with this, and there's sort of some crossover here. And so this is as separate as it gets, which is a good thing. This is pretty separate, because this is what you see at a lot of companies. This is what we call a full stack developer. You've got the gradient, and you've just got all the things here. And so this is a type of quote you might hear from a company. You might have heard this. Hey, Fletch, we need a shopping cart built real quick. Not sure what that means. Good luck. You got 2 months. Here's a timeline. Here's your gradient. So coming back to this looks pretty good, even though it might have looked a little bit confusing at first. Compared to this, it looks really good. Here's all the things. One of you figure it out. That's pretty great. So what is a concern? Now that I've sort of talked about the different concerns and the different people and the roles, the hats we wear, and like I said, you can wear multiple hats. You can take one hat off and put a hat on somewhere else. Usually adjacent. It's usually adjacent to you. You don't usually have someone wearing just 2 different hats on different sides of the spectrum. But a concern is a hat you wear. That's a really good way to think about it, is these concerns, these roles, in a very agile sense, thinking about the people and sort of combining the idea of how we do software engineering and how we do coding with people. Like, these are people that we're working with. So some of the concerns we have here is the look, the feel. I don't know if you guys can see my mouse when I'm doing this. Is there a way I can say, show my mouse? That's weird. No, don't. I don't know if I want to do that. I'm going to turn that off. That was really cool, though. I just now learned about that. In Zoom, there's a setting. Okay, well, I don't want to go into that too much because it just says look, feel, act here anyway. There's the look, there's the feel, there's how it acts, how it works, how it persists, how it interacts with other services in your same system, how it integrates with third-party systems like WorldPay or FedEx if you're looking for shipping stuff, or third-party systems, Google and whatnot. How it authenticates, how it authorizes. All this sort of thing, all these things are concerns. They're concerns of the system. And you have pretty much the roles. That's what the roles are on the left side. The designer, the UI UX person, the web dev. These are the roles that sort of go hand in hand with the concerns that we have. So you'll recognize some of these things from our other videos. I've had a video on cross-cutting concerns, and Floyd May has had a video on cross-cutting concerns, which is also on our YouTube. Oh, you can see my cursor. That's really nice. It's good to know. So let's go into some concerns. This is that gradient sort of turned on its side in order to look like it's like a typical graphic that you would see for software development. The presentation concern, UI design, native concerns, UX design. You've got the front boundary, which is the API. And you see these circles are only on one of these, not on all 3 of them. I do that for a reason, so keep that in mind. The API is a concern of ours. The domain business logic is a concern of ours. The data access, the data repos and resource access, they may not be hitting a database. They may be hitting maybe a third-party database, or a third-party pulling a website, scraping a website, or reading from local storage or file storage, file system. So this is the back boundary, the persistence, or what accesses the persistence. And then you have the persistence. Could be the file system, could be SQL or Oracle or a NoSQL database. These are the concerns. And if you learn nothing else from this, you see these are concerns, and they should be kept separate. The presentation layer, the UI, the web dev, shouldn't be programming anything that knows which database you're using. If nothing else, take that away from this. If you're making the UI, you've got the HTML, CSS, you've got your JavaScript. That JavaScript should not know anything about SQL Server or anything's even stored. Whenever the UI makes a callback to an API and says, give me a list of orders, it should just, as far as it's concerned, that API just made this stuff up, just magically created it and sent it back. It should not even know anything about persistence or even that persistence exists. That's how far away those 2 concerns are. Now, the closer you get, the more it understands the database. But as much as possible, these are the things that you want to keep separate. This is the reason why I only circled partially last time. These are cross-cutting concerns that we had other videos on. They're still separated vertically. I don't think I explicitly said that before. They're separated vertically, but you have this concern like authentication, which crosses over the horizontal boundary, because all of our APIs are going to use the same exact authentication system, at least in this system. Maybe you have a different system that uses slightly different, it depends. But we have all of these APIs using the same authentication system. That's what we call a cross-cutting concern. It's a concern we have of the API, and it crosses over all of our APIs. We want all of our APIs to be the same, essentially, in this system that we're talking about. Endpoint caching, all that sort of stuff. And then down here, these aren't the only cross-cutting concerns, but down here we have another example. CRUD abstractions is another good example. So all of our data access stuff that's hitting, let's say SQL Server or whatever the case is, they all do CRUD the same way. So so all three of these are going to have the same exact abstraction of CRUD built into them, and then they can have their own methods here and there. I'm not saying always do that. I'm saying that's one possible cross-cutting concern that you might have. So here's another way of looking at it, not cross-cutting concerns. This is still a concern. The API is one of the concerns we're talking about, but this API may use Azure as an Azure web app. That's how it's built. It's got some Azure NuGet packages built in there. This is an MVC controller. Maybe it's Microsoft MVC controllers that are running on IIS or something like that. I don't know. And these are AWS functions. So it's still an API, still has endpoints. It still has the same cross-cutting concerns of authentication and whatnot, and logging and caching and all that sort of stuff. But this one's implementation for its API is AWS functions. So this is to show that these things have their own implementations, but they're not cross-cutting concerns. They're individual implementations. So these middle ones, as the last example here, is processing. So the business logic and the business layer, which is the business logic of business rules. There's order processing. This processing is for customer transformations. This is payment processing. It's the processing layer. It's the business rules layer, and that's what goes here. So these are concerns, but they're not cross-cutting concerns because they're different implementations for each thing. So again, concerns are vertical. So whenever you slice up a system, this is like a system, one microservice system that an API, a UI is going to be using. It's got the presentation, the API, the business logic, the data access, and then of course a database outside of that. This is a vertical slice, a slice of the system that is vertically cut up by concern is the best way to put it. To come back and look at this, let me just, do that. These three different APIs, that's a horizontal slice. So you have these horizontal separations of systems, and that's called a bounded context. So one of these systems is bounded by, this is my context, this is my data store down here, this is my business logic, and this is my context, and they're bounded by rules that we put in place as software engineers to say, I'm going to bound myself like this. We're not going to be doing a bunch of interconnected stuff like a monolith would, for example. So these are distributed systems, microservices. They have a bounded context to them. And that's a horizontal thing. Vertically, you have separation of concerns. So why are we concerned? What's the point of this talk? Like, what do we have to be concerned about? And this is why I did a lot of the reading in the beginning of those examples that I had, because we all think differently. We're different people. I mean, it's cool if you can wear more than two hats. I think wearing one hat is plenty enough. Wearing two hats, that's really cool. Trying to wear all the hats, trying to be that gradient, that's all pushed together with all the things from the beginning to the end, that's crazy. It's a lot, because each one of those hats thinks differently. So you literally have to like change the physiological properties of your brain when you take off the hat from, I'm the vision and I'm doing all this stuff, this enterprise architecture and whatnot, and I'm trying to do the product owner, take that hat off. Okay, let me put this hat on and be the domain developer. And I'll take this one off and be the DBA, and worried about, backups and all this other stuff. It's a crazy thing to do. We all think differently. So it's important to understand that, and these are really good examples. This is an idea I have. This is like a business person that requires some compliance and case studies, maybe some legal stuff, and it's going to bring in this many dollars. So you're doing all this business stuff. And then you have this example, a user will find it most intuitive to take certain actions based on how the information is provided. So you have like the UX person who's done some research or some mapping, and they've seen the way that the users are using the site previously, and they're trying to apply that, and they're trying to build out an intuitive system based on that information. And you have the data science people, or the functional people, the domain people who are writing unit tests and whatnot, and they think about the system differently. They don't care about the user experience. They care about making sure that the data is transformed correctly. And then, of course, the disaster recovery, the database people, making sure it's stored and performant and all that sort of stuff. Why are we concerned? There's still more to be concerned about. We deliver, release, two different things, and test differently. So each of these roles, they deliver, release, and test the things that they're doing differently. So the businesses, they're concerned about demos and user acceptance testing, the feature changes and bug fixes. So if you're changing a feature, adding a feature, or doing a bug fix, they care about that, and they want to do a UAT, maybe a demo for the customer or whatever the case is. Maybe phase releases. I mean, we're getting into like way off in the weeds there. The UI UX people, they're concerned about the system, making sure that the UI works correctly, they're using Selenium or they're using tests in JavaScript to make sure that the UI fields are loading as expected, the input and outputs works as expected, and the design is correct, using these systems that are testing the visual parts of your user interface. You have the backend devs. They're mostly doing functional changes that have to do with unit tests. So unit tests are they're pure tests that are purely about functional changes, and QA test cases. So they're matching these up with QA test cases as much as they can for the domain, and they're writing unit tests against it. And then the data devs are writing dev integration tests, which are just making sure that the schema, when there's schema changes, making sure that whenever this code gets deployed, for example, more like when it gets released, when this code is released, that the database has the structure available to it that this code is expecting to happen. These are completely different mindsets in testing, that they require different tools, they require a different way of thinking. So to narrow that down a little bit more simply, businesses care about feature changes, UI UX engineers care about design changes, backend developers care about functional logic changes or conditional transformations, and data devs care about the schema of the database changing. These are such different things. Separation of concerns is really trying to understand that people think differently. The business systems, the processes we use to do our project management and our work items, they have to be thought of in different aspects. You can't just like put them under one umbrella and say they're all user stories, like everything is a user story, or everything's even the same kind of tasks. People think differently, these roles think differently, and they have to have a different mindset. So why are we concerned? So the business over asks for things that it just seems so simple to them. They think the SDLC is magic. So every task, they're like, hey, we need to add a birth date to the sign up form. So you've got a sign up form for something, they want to add a birth date to it. And they just think that's the thing, add a birth date. And then whenever you deploy it, you deploy the add a birth date like it's one thing. It's not one thing. There's a lot to adding a birth date, or maybe it could be super simple, but it needs to be thought of as different forms of tasks. The businesses, they don't understand CI/CD. They think it's scary that not only do they think this is one change, add a birth date, but they think that when you add the birth date, the system is being redeployed, like the system is being redeployed, run all the tests, get in there and do all of the performance checks, do all the everything, and automated regression testing and make sure your tests are up to date. It's important. That's great. And that sort of stuff should always be ran for the things that were affected, not for run the entire system. If your system's fragile enough that some change in some other microservice that's probably not even concerned with you is broken by some change in some other microservice that you're doing, then that's just something that needs to be brought up as we need to make sure that we're doing a better bounded context. Like I was saying, that horizontal slicing. So they have this mindset because a lot of people come from the monolithic background, where when you change something, you deploy the system in this monolith. That's not uncommon. Even current clients I work with have that type of mentality and that type of system. But the better ones and the ones that are growing the fastest, I would say, are moving toward or already in sort of this microservice setup. So here's an example of like splitting this thing up. here's sort of the different things. Part of these say, I don't care. So like the API, if you add a birth date to the user interface, the API doesn't care. And when the user interface sends it to the API, they send just JSON API. The API just gets it. JSON, I see it's frozen, hopefully not just for you. Oh no. I mean, my internet's working. I'm gonna give you guys a second. I know there's a little bit of lag. Okay, it says it just came back. Okay, I don't know how far back that you guys missed, but yeah, the API doesn't care because it's just being sent JSON from the user interface, and that JSON is being just serialized, deserialized into a model, and the API isn't doing anything. It's just a dummy that's DTLing, passing through data. The domain also doesn't care. I mean, you do have to go add a property to a model, but most of us know that's not a breaking change. Adding a property to a model is not a breaking change. Just like adding a column to a database isn't a breaking change. But the point I'm trying to get at here is a migration. You build a migration script or DB up script, or what people call them different things, and you send it to the DBA. You can deploy that separately. You say, hey, add this column, set it as default null, or if it's not nullable, that's something we'll decide on later. We'll put a default value in there, but deploy that thing. That's one task. That's done. It's an agile thing. Go ahead and add that all the way through to production. We're not even done with development yet, but we know we're going to need this thing. It doesn't matter what's deployed first. Go ahead and do that. When the API is updated and it says it needs to require that, it can be deployed whenever it's ready to be deployed with the new models. Before then, it'll still work exactly as it had before. The user interface, they need to know whether or not the feature's on, because if this new feature with the birth date is off, then don't show that field on the user form, sign up form, or whatever it is. Don't show the birth date field. Just keep it working as it is. The JSON will keep sending the API just like it was. But once that API is deployed and it sends back a key that, hey, this feature's enabled, then the UI will show the field. So you can deploy the UI even before the API is finished, even before the database column was added, because that API will be sending back the feature key saying this feature's off. And the UI, even if it's deployed all the way to production, as long as it's saying the feature's off, it'll keep working as it has and sending without the birth date, for example. The moment the API is deployed and it has that sort of stuff, the point is, if you have your system set up with separation of concerns and feature gating, then these things can be deployed differently. And also you have this piece of the system doesn't care, and it makes it a lot easier to say, just deploy the things whenever you want. You can test them individually. You can set up your UAT for whenever the UI is ready to go and the feature is turned on. That's called released. It's deployed, but until it's turned on, it's not released. When it's turned on, it's called being released. So there's the solution for it's just called separation of concerns. Feature gating is not required for separation of concerns, but it's definitely a helpful thing. So why are we concerned? This is just a recap, essentially, of that gradient. You got the legal, compliance, QABA, vision, the UI design, marketing, UX research development. You've got each one of these things. Let's just say UX research and development, or UI design, or one in the middle, functional development, for the domain, data science. We'll say data science. Each one of these is a career. Each one of these is a thing that's going to take 5, give or take, years to say, okay, I am an expert at this. Let's say you've been a data scientist for 10 years and you've been writing this domain code, and you're really good at taking requirements, and you're a data scientist. And at some point you become an expert is pretty much all I'm trying to get at. Legal, UI design, all of these things are on a huge gradient. Small businesses are great. There's a lot of startups and a lot of small businesses. I've worked with a dozen different small businesses, and they frequently require a full stack developer. Unfortunately for them, they got me. So you get what you get. So you get a developer, and that developer is supposed to teach them how to set up their systems, their business systems, in an agile way. They want them to do all the things. I don't need to go back through them, design the API, the domain, the data. They want them to do all the things. And that's really cool. And sometimes that's necessary. For a small business, it's a startup. They haven't hired, 5 developers, 3, 4 QA people. They haven't done all that store stuff yet. They're not there. We've got stacks. We've got stacks and stacks of stacks. LAMP stack, Blazor, mean stack. You've got, there's lots of really cool stacks that we have up there. By default, they do not observe separation of concerns. As a matter of fact, the opposite. By default, they are, tightly coupled, especially the Microsoft ones, but even LAMP, the LAMP stack, or if you're working with WordPress or something like that, it's just sort of like all one thing. It's all a monolith, even if it's a small monolith. The main stack is pretty cool because it does still sort of set this precedent that you're going to have a Node backend, which I'm not a fan of, but some people are a fan of Node. But you have a Node backend at least separated from the Angular front end, so that's pretty cool. And especially if they're deployed separately, as long as you then go into the Node backend and you sort of separate that out to the API, the domain part, and the part that does business data access, and you can do that with Blazor, and you can do that with LAMP in PHP. You can observe, as I'm saying here at the bottom, you can logically separate them into separation of concerns. You don't have to have a whole different language or a whole different system for the front end, a different language for the API that's then like calling some sort of different language for like C# calling into an F# domain library for data science, and then like some other thing, framework for data. You don't need all that stuff as an actual constraint of separation of concerns, but a logical separation. You want these things to be in slightly different projects or separate into different modules that then maybe they compile together or whatever the case is. But I just have a logical separation because that will force, that will force Conway's law. Conway's law is not something that you can change. Conway's law says organizations design software whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. And that's just a law. I mean, it's called Conway's law. There's nothing you can do about it. If you break it, you're going to jail. Conway's law is an observation of patterns that just happen in life. It's just something that happens. The communication structure in this case is like the ticket system. You have work items, you have epics, you have features, you have user stories, you have tasks. You have all these things broken down. If you just smush them all together, guess what your code's going to look like? It's just going to be a monolith. And then guess what your CI/CD is going to look like? You're going to have to deploy the whole monolith. Forget separation of deployments from releases. That's just a deployment's a release. That's just the end of that story. Whenever you just smush everything together, it just happens in both places. You can't change one without the other. So you can't say we're in this business system where we are all, where everything's all smushed together. We just use the user story work item and there are tasks. Nothing's all organized. It's just like a blob of whatever. But our code is pretty. That doesn't happen. It just can't happen because they're developing things in the business like this. They set expectations of the similar style. And so the code is going to match that. And similarly, you can't have code that's a monolith, but say, oh yeah, let's break this down into nice, neat user stories that are separated by feature, because they're not separated by feature. You're working in a monolith, and the mentality just won't be there. You have to change them at the same time and have the separation of concerns, have the different tasks, and keep things separate. Hot take time. So you have a recruiter and they post, this is my hot take. So give me a moment with my own hot take here. Looking for a full stack developer with at least 3 years of experience. And this is a beef I have with the term full stack developer, which is a thing, but it depends on how you look at it. A full stack developer with at least 3 years of experience, does this mean that they've done front end for a number of years and back end for a number of years? They've done DevOps, SRE stuff for a number of years and been a DBA for a number of years, and they've done all these things. But then after all that experience, they've had 3 years worth of being a full stack developer, like saying, I've worked with all this stuff directly. So 3 years of experience as a full stack developer? Or does it mean I started programming 3 years ago, I'll be your full stack developer? It's sort of a beef that I have with recruiters mainly, especially because they're working with businesses and the businesses don't know what they want or what they need. And they tell a recruiter and they say, you need a 3-year full stack developer. And actually what they always mean is someone who just started a couple of years ago. They'll take you if you've done 1 or 2 years and you're their full stack developer. So a lot of you watching this may be full stack developers, but don't fall into, I don't remember where that thing was, that thing where you're that whole gradient, and don't set the precedent for the company that you're going to do all the stuff for them. Instead, set the precedent for the company that I will do development. I will wear 2 or 3 hats, and I will teach you guys who you need to hire, what you need to do. You need a DBA or whatever, may or may not. Maybe that's one of the hats you wear, or you need this person, you need this person. Teach them that type of thing, but don't fall into the trap of being the full gradient put all together, which unfortunately is what a recruiter means. So the solution, if you want to avoid a user story like this that says it's assigned to you, build a shopping website. If you want to avoid that, what you need to do is make sure you're observing separation of concerns, and you start from the business level. Start by telling them, hey, this isn't good enough. You need to break this down into minimally viable products, deliverables that we're going to call user stories, and then I will help you separate into tasks, and we'll have these different work. You need to start this from the business mentality, or if you are a business person watching this, thank you for coming and watching this. And because they have to change together. Conway's law. You can't just say, okay, as a developer, I'll make sure I try to do this in code. It won't end up working out. And then lastly, some systems are really super simple. Maybe it's a static site or WordPress site or something that's super simple, in which you could be a full stack developer who's like a super basic, just HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and maybe a little bit of database stuff. That's doing some super basic stuff for a startup company. That's great. That's perfectly fine. No one has any beef with that. That makes perfect sense.